All right, Starlink. There is barely a campsite you can go to around Australia where you will not find one of these dishes either on top of a caravan or plonked out in front of a tent. It has certainly changed the game when it comes to off-grid travel in Australia. Probably the biggest change to caravanning and off-grid travel since lithium batteries. It has certainly changed the game as far as living and traveling around the country, especially in somewhere like Australia, where connectivity is very hard to come by in some remote regions. But there's definitely some cons to the system as well. We're going to take you through all that and more, as well as a new product to the Australian market that we're really excited about that solves a couple of the biggest challenges and the biggest cons to the Starlink system. If you're thinking about going traveling, or if you're already out there traveling and you want connectivity while you travel to work on the road like we do, or just that you like to have your Netflix and you want to stay connected to the internet, stick around. We're going to run you through everything that we've learned about Starlink after having it for over 12 months now, as well as that new product to the Australian market that we think is an absolute game changer. Let's dive into it. All right, so kicking things off, what are the pros to Starlink? Well, obviously, as it's advertised, as you would have heard people talk about, you can get connectivity everywhere in Australia. In theory, there are some areas where that's not the case, and I think it's something that isn't talked about enough and not enough people realise. To get a connection with this Starlink dish, what you need is a view of the southern sky, and it needs to be quite a decent view. It's something like 170 degrees wide and 70 degrees vertically. You need a clear view of the sky. Now, what if you don't have that? If there's trees like behind me, or if you're in a built-up area where there might be buildings or other obstructions, that will mean that your Starlink connection will drop out periodically. Now, the dropout may be to zero connectivity, it may just reduce the connectivity, and it may be for an extended period of time, or it may be just for a short period of time, depending on how significant the obstruction is. The other thing that can cause an obstruction to the dish is cloud cover and weather conditions can cause issues with the connection and does affect its connectivity. Some of the other pros to the system are that it's relatively compact and it's not that heavy. All that the system consists of is this dish here, which probably weighs 4 or 5 kilos at the most, and a small router. One of the cons though is that that router does require 240 volt power, so you need to be able to run an inverter or something like that if you're off grid, or obviously if you're plugged in to shore power, then that's less of an issue. But for most people, you want to be off grid, and that's why you want Starlink, so you can travel away from the towns and cities. And that's where you do need to be able to run an inverter. More on that in a minute though. We have found a solution to that. One of the other pros to Starlink is that you can pause and restart your subscription. So if you only travel for a few months of the year, or even less than that, you can run your Starlink just for the times that you're traveling. Keep in mind though that you do have to keep it in blocks of 1 month. So the minimum amount of time you can have it running is for 1 month, and you need to pause it and restart it at the right time to make sure you don't pay for a full month when you don't need it. But that is definitely one of the big pros, because one of the big cons is the cost. It is about $175 a month to have a Starlink connection when you want to be roaming, as they call it. So that means that you aren't having the dish in one fixed location and you're traveling around like we do. So $175, that does give you unlimited downloads, and it does give you, in a lot of places, those lightning fast speeds that you'll see advertised. We frequently see 100 megabytes a second plus in our downloads, and it's anywhere around sort of 10 to 15 megabytes. Upload is pretty common, which is really, really handy, especially if you want to upload videos and content like we do. The other downside to the Starlink is that it runs in cells in a similar way to your mobile phone network. So if you're in built-up areas where a lot of people are running a Starlink system, then you will find that your speeds will be reduced because there's more people trying to connect to those same satellites as you are in that area. The advantage though is that when you go more and more remote, obviously there's fewer and fewer people that are running Starlink out there, and generally the connection gets better, and you generally find the more remote you go, there's fewer trees and fewer obstructions as well. So that's one of the things we really like about the Starlink system, is it gets better as you go more remote, which ties hand in hand with our 4 and 5G connection, which generally gradually gets worse the more remote that we travel. So for us, the best of both worlds is to have a good 4 and 5G connection, as well as our Starlink as backup. Because there are periods of time, even though we're traveling all the time, where for a few months at a time, we might not need our Starlink connection, when we're traveling the East Coast or something like that, where there's generally really good 4 and 5G availability. Now, as I said earlier, when you're in built-up areas, the Starlink speeds can be significantly lower than those sort of 3-digit download speeds and the double-digit upload speeds, and often we find a 5G connection actually exceeds the performance of the Starlink in those areas, and that's why we like to have a 5G solution as well as our Starlink solution. So for us to get 4 and 5G into our van and around our campsite, we use a Cowfish 5G router. Now that router is connected to a 5G antenna on our roof that's permanently mounted, that just needs a 12-volt supply, and that runs all the time and gives us a Wi-Fi signal, as I said, in the van as well as around our campsite. That will actually transmit from the antenna on the roof, which is both a 4 and 5G receiver and a Wi-Fi emitter, up to 100 meters around our campsite. We've got a Wi-Fi signal as long as we've got a 4 and 5G connection. That's our primary internet solution, and the advantage to that is it's extremely cost effective. Once you've purchased and installed the hardware, the ongoing cost is relatively low, and you can use a prepaid SIM card, a plan. If you're a Telstra customer already, you can do data sharing and get a second SIM to put in there and data share with your phone plans. There's a whole lot of different ways you can set it up. We'd recommend using a Telstra SIM or a SIM that's connected to the Telstra network. Boost is the other option apart from Telstra themselves. It has a full access to the Telstra network. Be aware of other third-party providers that claim to use the Telstra network, which they do, but they don't have access to the full network, and often you won't get 5G, and you also won't get priority over other Telstra customers. So it is something to be aware of. I think if you're going to go to this extent to try and get connectivity and stable connection, it's worth spending that a little bit extra to either be connected to Telstra, or our preference is Boost, because we can just buy data packs that last 12 months, and then it doesn't matter if we have a big data month or a quieter data month, for example, when we might be using our Starlink that month. So how does Starlink fit into this? Well, up until pretty recently, they were two completely independent systems. We would just run our 4 and 5G when we had good connection, and when we didn't, we would unpause our Starlink plan, fire that up and run the Starlink for as long as we needed to, and this would get used infrequently in towns and things like that, but relatively little. As I said, that was until recently. What's changed the game, and what we think is probably one of the biggest advancements to Starlink in Australia, and something we're really excited about, is this little box up in here which I installed recently. This is what's known as the Cowfish Starlink integration module. In effect, what that does is that takes the signal from the Starlink satellite dish, runs it through the Cowfish router. Now, one of the advantages of that is it means we can just do away with the Starlink router, the one that comes supplied with the unit. But one of the other big advantages is that that is now a 12-volt solution. It now has removed the need for us to run an inverter when we need to run the Starlink. And we woke up this morning after leaving our EnerDrive inverter turned on, and our two BTEC 300 amp batteries, so 600 amps of battery, was down to 50%. Now that wasn't just the Starlink and the inverter running overnight. Obviously, we also ran the dishwasher last night and cooked dinner and all the things we would normally do, but normally we would wake up with about 70% battery. So it did definitely cut into our reserve just by forgetting to turn the inverter off. Now the advantage of now that we can run it through the 12 volt in this is that we are now able to run the whole thing off 12 volt, and we can pretty much leave our Starlink on all the time, and we're only going to use that 5 or 6 amps that the Starlink itself uses, which is a massive improvement. It also means that if you're traveling and don't have an inverter in your setup, you now no longer need an inverter just to be able to run your Starlink. So you can run it from your car or your canopy setup if you're traveling without a caravan or a trailer. So when it came to installing the Starlink integration kit in our van, putting it as close as you can to the Cowfish router makes the most sense. We had this space up the top of the back of the overhead cupboard where we had already installed our Cowfish router, and it also allowed relatively easy access into the back of our electrical system. We've also got this little fuse box there up in the top cupboard where all our switch gear is, that had a spare circuit there, so I was able to just plug straight into that to get the 12 volt power to the Starlink integration kit. Apart from that, it's just using the supplied RJ45 lead to connect it to the Cowfish router, and then you just need to run a secondary lead from the Starlink integration unit down to wherever you install the plug that will connect your Starlink from the outside of the van. And one of the other big downsides or challenges to the Starlink is that the lead that runs from the dish into the router is this proprietary plug that is not really compatible with anything else on the market. So the challenge for most people, including us, is getting this cord from the dish, which is obviously outside the caravan or the camper or whatever it is, inside. And that hasn't been easy until recently. Now, as part of the Starlink integration kit, what Cowfish have come up with is 2 solutions to be able to get this into your van. Now, one is this adapter here, which takes the plug from the Starlink and you place that in there like that, and that converts it to a standard RJ45 connection. What's an RJ45? Well, that's your standard sort of network cable connection, that click-in connection you'd be used to from phones, any sort of communication devices from donkeys years ago. If you remember when you used to have to plug into your dial-up modem, that sort of connection. Now this will adapt that then to RJ45, which you can then run any sort of RJ45 connection and lead through into your van. You can get pass-throughs and things like that that will allow you to do that. The only downside to this is that it's not waterproof, weatherproof, dustproof, etc. So you need to be careful that where this is mounted is protected from all of that. So for us, that still provided a challenge to get the connection into the van on a permanent or semi-permanent basis. So the other solution that Cowfish offer is this thing here. Now this is only half of it. I've already installed the other half, but this is a waterproof, dustproof connection. So you can put a hole into the side of your van, or in my case, I put it up through the floor. And this will give you a connection from the Starlink dish straight into the van, and then a patch lead or an RJ45 cable goes from that up into the Starlink integration kit, which then sends the signal to the Cowfish router. The downside to this is you do have to cut your Starlink cord and just put an RJ45 connection directly onto this cable, and then this waterproof connection is an RJ45 waterproof connection. This is the last stage for us for our 12-volt connection for the Starlink. You do need a special tool to be able to do the RJ45 crimp, to crimp that on. You can go to a communication place or something like that, or if there's someone in your area that does communications, they may be able to do it for you, or you can buy the special tool. You can buy it at Bunnings or anywhere like that. Where we are at the moment, there's not a lot of Bunnings around, so that's the last stage for us. Luckily for me, we're meeting up with a mate of mine tomorrow who's got one of those tools with him, so I'm going to be using his, which is even better. Cutting the cord on your Starlink cable can be a little bit nerve-wracking, but it's pretty straightforward if you just follow the instructions that come with your Starlink integration kit and take your time. It's a little bit fiddly, but very achievable to do. Like I said, you will need that special crimping tool, or find someone who has one that you can borrow and get it done that way. Once you've got that connection crimped on, you then put the waterproof housing on and you are good to go. We should say that Cowfish did send us the Starlink integration kit, but it's not a sponsored video by Cowfish. They're not paying us to make this video. We do like to make that clear. They have also given us a discount code though, so you can get 10% off any Cowfish gear on the website, including the Starlink integration kit and that Cowfish 45G modem. So if you think this is for you and would suit your setup, then head over to the Cowfish website. I'll leave a link in the description below and chuck in that code and save yourself some dollars as well. All right, so at this point, I wanted to sort of try and preempt a few questions that you guys might have. We've got the kit installed now. We've used it now for a little bit, and it's absolutely fantastic. I think it is, as much as it's an overused word, particularly on YouTube, I think it actually is a game changer. But why would you have a 4 and 5G and a Starlink connection? Why don't they sort of compete with each other? What is the point to that? Well, there's a few advantages to having both, because even though we've now solved the issue of having to run the inverter and we've now been able to get the cable into the van, there is still a few downsides to Starlink. The biggest one really is just the cost. Because you can pause the Starlink for whatever period of time that you don't need to use it, it means that when we're in areas like the east coast of Australia and places like that where there's generally good 4 and 5G connection available, we can utilise that network rather than the Starlink and keep the Starlink paused, and it costs us absolutely nothing, and it's a lot more cost effective. The other one is that there's just zero setup and pack up with the 4 and 5G router, so if we can pull up just for an overnighter in a campsite somewhere or in a roadside stop, and we've got internet no matter what, and it also keeps the internet running while we're driving, so we're able to connect to that network as we travel along. So there's a few advantages there for us. The other big advantage for us with having the system that we have is with that rooftop antenna that I mentioned earlier, we now get the benefits of that extended Wi-Fi range that antenna gives us when we're using Starlink as well. So that's a nice little side benefit. Overall, for us, having both a 4 or 5G and a Starlink solution just means that we have got internet and connectivity just about everywhere in Australia, and it also is the best solution for us because of schooling that we do with the kids, the business that we run on the road, and all of that sort of stuff. Just internet is very, very important to us, but it may not be as important to you, so you may decide you only want one of the two solutions. What Cowfish have done for those of you that may not want a 4 and 5G router and you just want the 12 volt Starlink, they've done what's called the Cowfish Zero, which is exactly that. It's just the 12 volt component for your Starlink. It won't give you 4 and 5G, but it is a 12 volt router for your Starlink, which is a really good option. It's also a little bit more cost effective if you don't want to spend as much money on hardware as it would cost you to do a 4 and 5G solution. But if you jump onto their website, all the information's there, everything you need. Read through all that, and if you've got any questions, leave us a comment below. Another question I can anticipate is why not mount the Starlink dish to the roof of the van or somewhere on the van, or put it on a pole and things like that. I just think it gives you less flexibility. Often we find we run the dish quite a way away from the caravan to get the best clear view of the sky, out from under a tree or something like that, to get that view of the southern sky. So I just think, although it's a little bit more set up and pack up potentially, now that we've got that waterproof pass-through that we can just plug it into the van, it's pretty quick and easy, and I just think it gives you maximum flexibility. Now, one other thing you may be thinking is, if you've gone ahead and cut your Starlink cable, if you decided to do the installation option that we've done, and you cut your Starlink cable, what if you want to go and you might use your Starlink at home or something like that, or for whatever reason you may want to still use the Starlink factory router. You can do that by creating a patch lead. Cowfish supply an extra RJ45 and a connector. So what we've done there is just put another RJ45 on the leftover cable, or the plug that we cut off. Just make sure you leave yourself a bit of a tail, and then you can just use this connector, connect this into the other cable that we made, and then it basically just means your cable has a join in it, and you can use it with the factory router if that's something that you need to be able to do. As always, guys, if you've got any questions or comments, please leave us a comment below. We love hearing from all of you guys. Don't forget to hit that like button if you enjoyed this video, and if you find our content useful, consider subscribing. It's completely free for you. All you got to do is click that little subscribe button. It gives us the warm and fuzzies, doesn't cost you a cent. But until next time, we'll see you guys next Sunday. Cheers. Are you listening to this?
Yeah.
Is it good? Early signs are that it is an absolute game changer. Connectivity, then you probably just, I don't even know where I was going with that.
Right now it's perfect. Now just dive in. Obviously the pros are, but the cons are.